Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in Georgia's history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The winter of 1838 brought an unusual cold to Savannah County, Georgia. Frost patterns clung to window panes throughout the plantation homes that dotted the countryside, creating delicate artwork that dissolved with the morning sun's weak attempts to warm the land. It was during this particular winter that the name Calhoun would become synonymous with something darker than the frozen earth surrounding their estate. The records remain, yellowed and fragile, in the Savannah County Historical Society archives, partial testimonies, a fragment of a journal, and courthouse documents that paint an incomplete picture of what truly happened at Willow Creek Plantation. According to official records, Margaret Calhoun, wife of prominent plantation owner Edward Calhoun, was arrested on January 17, 1838, for the alleged murder of their house servant, a woman named Sarah. The evidence seemed conclusive. Margaret's nightgown found soaked in blood, hidden beneath floorboards in her private dressing room. A silver letter opener with her initials, discovered near Sarah's quarters, its tip darkened with dried blood. And most damning of all, Edward Calhoun's testimony that he had witnessed his wife returning to their bedroom in the early hours, her hands stained crimson. What made the case particularly strange, however, was a detail mentioned by only one witness, the gardener Thomas Miller. In his statement to the county sheriff, he noted that on the morning following the murder, he observed Edward Calhoun burning papers in the plantation's outdoor kitchen, something he had never seen the master do before. This detail was quickly dismissed when Edward explained they were merely old correspondence that no longer needed to be kept. The court accepted this without question. After all, Edward Calhoun was a third-generation plantation owner, respected throughout Georgia, a man whose grandfather had signed his name alongside other patriots during the Revolution. But historical records show something peculiar about Willow Creek Plantation. Unlike most neighboring estates, detailed inventories and agricultural records were meticulously kept, not just of crop yields and profits, but of every aspect of plantation life, except for the 2 months surrounding Sarah's murder. For this period, the usually detailed Calhoun records show an inexplicable gap. When county officials inquired years later as part of a tax assessment, Edward simply stated that unfortunate circumstances had made proper record-keeping impossible during that time. Margaret Calhoun's trial lasted only 4 days, remarkably brief for a murder case. The jury, composed entirely of men who had dined at Edward's table at least once, deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict. She was sentenced to hang. Historical records indicate that upon hearing her sentence, Margaret did not weep or protest, but simply turned to look at her husband with an expression that one court observer described as not of fear, but of terrible recognition. Before her sentence could be carried out, however, Margaret Calhoun was found dead in her cell. The official report stated that she had taken her own life by fashioning a noose from her bed linens. No investigation was conducted. Her body was not returned to the Calhoun family plot, but was instead buried in unconsecrated ground outside the cemetery walls, as was customary for those who died by their own hand. Edward Calhoun remarried 6 months later to Carolyn Pemberton, daughter of another plantation owner whose lands conveniently adjoined his own. The marriage effectively doubled the Calhoun holdings. Life at Willow Creek Plantation resumed its rhythmic pace, the whispers about Margaret fading with each season's passing. What happened at Willow Creek might have remained buried alongside Margaret's unmarked grave, if not for a discovery made 22 years later. In 1860, as Sherman's march devastated Georgia, a Union soldier seeking valuables in the abandoned Calhoun mansion discovered a small compartment behind a loose brick in the parlor fireplace. Inside was a journal, its pages filled with Margaret's handwriting, dated from December 1837 to January 1838, stopping just 3 days before Sarah's murder. The journal was confiscated and eventually found its way to a military archivist named James Whitmore, who recognized its potential historical significance. However, the journal mysteriously disappeared from the military archives in 1865. Only Whitmore's personal notes about its contents survived, hidden among his private papers discovered after his death in 1879. Those notes suggest that Margaret had been documenting increasingly disturbing behavior from her husband in the weeks before the murder. According to Whitmore's transcribed excerpts, Margaret wrote of Edward's growing financial troubles, his increasing dependence on alcohol, and his violent outbursts toward the house servants, particularly Sarah. One partial entry reads, "E returned past midnight again, his speech slurred and movements unsteady. When I inquired about the Savannah meeting, he struck the wall beside my head with such force that plaster rained down upon my shoulders. He apologized immediately, blaming the Pemberton deal falling through, but his eyes remained cold, even as he kissed my forehead." Another fragment mentions Sarah directly. "Sarah informed me today that E has been visiting her quarters after midnight. She appeared frightened and asked to be reassigned to kitchen duties. I promised to speak with E, though I fear his reaction. The bruises on her wrists told stories her lips dared not speak." The most disturbing excerpt from Whitmore's notes quotes Margaret's journal just days before the murder. "I found the ledger E keeps hidden beneath the loose floorboard in his study. The figures make no sense unless, God help us, he plans to sell everything, even the people whose families have been here for generations." When confronted, he laughed in that hollow way that makes my skin crawl. He said, "My dear Margaret, by month's end, our problems shall vanish like morning mist." I fear what solution he has devised. After the war, as Reconstruction changed the landscape of Georgia, a former slave from Willow Creek named Joseph provided testimony to the Freedmen's Bureau in 1868. His account, preserved in their records, offered another perspective on the events of 1838. According to Joseph, on the night Sarah was killed, he had been unable to sleep due to a persistent cough and was sitting outside his cabin when he saw Edward Calhoun crossing the grounds toward the servants' quarters, carrying what appeared to be a small bundle. Hours later, Joseph witnessed Edward returning to the main house, stopping at the well to wash his hands thoroughly despite the winter cold. Joseph never spoke of what he saw until after emancipation, explaining, "Who would believe the word of a slave over that of Master Calhoun, and what would happen to my family if I spoke?" His testimony to the bureau agent included the statement, "Miss Margaret, she wasn't the kind to hurt nobody. She was the one who taught some of us to read, secret-like, when Master wasn't around. She knew what was happening to Sarah. She was trying to help her." In 1859, shortly before the Civil War erupted, Edward Calhoun died suddenly at the age of 49. The official cause was listed as apoplexy, but rumors circulated among locals that he had been poisoned. His second wife, Caroline, inherited the plantation, but fled north as Union forces approached Georgia. After the war, the property was divided, portions going to formerly enslaved families under Reconstruction policies, the main house eventually abandoned to decay. A curious footnote to this story emerged in 1910, when a historian researching Georgia plantation life discovered court records indicating that in the weeks before Sarah's murder, Edward Calhoun had taken out substantial loans against his property and slaves. These loans had been due for repayment in February 1838, just weeks after Margaret's arrest. The records showed that upon Margaret's conviction, control of her substantial inheritance, previously protected by her marriage settlement and not legally accessible to Edward, transferred to him as her surviving husband. This sudden financial windfall allowed Edward to pay his debts and expand his holdings through his second marriage. The limestone marker that once indicated Margaret Calhoun's burial place outside the cemetery walls has long since weathered away. No photographs of her exist in historical archives, her features lost to time. But county records do contain one final, haunting detail. In 1872, an elderly woman who had served as housemaid at Willow Creek during Margaret's time gave a deathbed confession to her pastor. She claimed that on the morning after Sarah's murder, she had been cleaning Margaret's room when Edward entered, carrying the blood-stained nightgown that would later be discovered beneath the floorboards. The maid hid in the adjoining dressing room, watching through a crack in the door as Edward deliberately planted the evidence, murmuring to himself, "Forgive me, Margaret, but one of us must bear this burden." The pastor recorded the confession, but perhaps understanding its implications for prominent families still living in the county, sealed it in the church archives with instructions that it not be opened until 1920. By that time, the last of the direct Calhoun line had died without heirs, the family name fading into obscurity. Today, Willow Creek Plantation exists only as overgrown foundations, the main house long since collapsed into its cellar. Local tours occasionally stop to point out the location, mentioning the tragic murderous wife, without delving deeper into the story. But those who have researched the primary sources, the fragments of evidence that survived war, time, and intentional obscuring, paint a different picture. Of a woman framed by her husband for financial gain, of justice perverted by social standing and gender, of truth buried but never completely erased. In 1959, during highway expansion near the former plantation grounds, construction workers uncovered a small metal box buried approximately 3 feet underground. Inside was a tarnished silver locket containing a miniature portrait of a woman believed to be Margaret, alongside a folded paper. The paper, severely damaged by moisture and time, contained only a fragment of readable text. Should this be found, know that I, Margaret Calhoun, am innocent of the crime for which I have been convicted. Let history know that on the night of January, the rest had been rendered illegible by water damage. The Georgia Historical Society has the locket in their collection, though the document was too fragile to preserve and disintegrated shortly after discovery. A curator made a handwritten copy of the visible text before it was lost completely. In 1961, a graduate student named Eleanor Hayes began researching the Calhoun case for her doctoral dissertation on gender and justice in antebellum Georgia. 3 months into her research, after reporting that she had discovered compelling new evidence in private correspondence between Edward and his business partners, Hayes was involved in a fatal car accident on a rural road outside Savannah. Her research notes were never recovered from her university office, which suffered a small fire the night of her death. The dissertation remained uncompleted, another thread of the story cut short. Those who visit the former Willow Creek grounds often report an unusual stillness, as if the very air resists movement. Local legends claim that on January evenings, when the winter mist rises from the creek that gave the plantation its name, the figure of a woman can be seen moving among the ruins, searching for something or someone never to be found. Perhaps most telling is an entry discovered in the personal diary of Judge William Hargrove, who presided over Margaret's trial. Written 2 decades after her conviction, as he approached the end of his life, it simply stated, "Of all the sentences I have pronounced in my 40 years on the bench, only one haunts my dreams. God forgive me for what justice I failed to provide Margaret Calhoun." The truth of what happened at Willow Creek Plantation on that January night in 1838 may never be fully known. Records are incomplete, witnesses long dead, evidence scattered by time and circumstance. What remains are fragments that suggest a narrative far different from the official account, a narrative of a woman silenced not just by death, but by a system that valued property over justice, appearance over truth, and a husband's word over a wife's life. In 1866, a former slave from a neighboring plantation told a northern journalist about a conversation she had overheard between Edward and Caroline Calhoun shortly after their marriage. When Caroline asked why he kept Sarah's former quarters locked, Edward reportedly replied, "Some doors are best left closed, my dear. What lies behind them serves no purpose but to remind us of unpleasant necessities." According to the account, he then took the key and dropped it into the well, the same well where Joseph had seen him washing his hands on the night of the murder. The well was filled in during the 1870s, its location now unmarked and forgotten. Records in the Savannah County Courthouse show that in April 1838, just weeks after Margaret's death, Edward Calhoun submitted legal papers to officially change the name of the plantation from Willow Creek to Prosperity Point. Local newspapers praised the name change as showing forward-thinking optimism from one of our county's most esteemed citizens, despite recent personal tragedy. The new name never fully took hold in local usage, however, with most residents continuing to refer to the property as Willow Creek until its eventual abandonment. A meteorological note in the Savannah Chronicle dated January 18, 1838, the day after Sarah's body was discovered, reported that the previous night had brought the heaviest snowfall in recent memory, with accumulations of over 6 inches, rendering many roads impassable. This unusual weather event effectively isolated Willow Creek Plantation for nearly 2 days, during which time the only investigation of the crime scene was conducted by the county sheriff, a second cousin to Edward Calhoun by marriage. Like so many aspects of this story, what evidence it might have contained remains buried, inaccessible to those who still seek answers about what truly happened to Sarah, to Margaret, and to the truth itself. Church attendance records from St. James Episcopal Church in Savannah show that in the 3 Sundays before Sarah's murder, Margaret Calhoun was absent from services, breaking her previously perfect attendance. Edward attended alone, explaining to fellow parishioners that his wife was suffering from nervous exhaustion and required rest. The parish minister, Reverend Thomas Blackwood, noted in his private journal that Edward had requested prayers for Margaret's troubled mind and restless spirit, language that would later be referenced during her trial as evidence of her unstable mental condition. In a letter dated March 1838, discovered in 1949 during renovation of the old Savannah courthouse, Edward Calhoun wrote to the judge before Margaret's trial, "I fear my dear wife's mind has been overtaken by a darkness beyond her control. While I have tried to shield her from harsh realities of plantation management, perhaps my protection has rendered her unable to distinguish between right and wrong." A small notation in the medical examiner's report on Sarah's death, largely overlooked during the trial, mentioned that the fatal wounds appeared to have been inflicted by a right-handed individual with considerable physical strength. Historical records and Margaret's own journal indicate that she was notably left-handed and of slight physical build, described by contemporaries as delicate and frail in constitution. Caroline Pemberton Calhoun, who benefited significantly from Margaret's removal, left behind few personal records. I speak these words with the heaviest of hearts, but justice must be served, regardless of my personal anguish. The letter was marked confidential and was not entered into official court records. However, a cousin's memoir published in 1882 referenced a disturbing comment Caroline made at a family gathering in 1850. Marriage to Edward required certain understandings. In 1863, as Union forces moved through Georgia, a soldier named Patrick O'Malley wrote to his wife in Massachusetts about finding a small grave, unmarked save for a carved wooden cross, hidden behind the slave quarters of an abandoned plantation. Local guides told him it was the resting place of a house girl who died bad. O'Malley noted that fresh wildflowers had been placed on the grave, suggesting that someone still remembers, still cares for this forgotten soul. Whether this was Sarah's true burial place remains speculation, as no official record of her interment exists. There are questions one learns never to ask, rooms one learns never to enter. When pressed by her cousin about this cryptic statement, Caroline allegedly changed the subject and refused to elaborate. The investigation into Sarah's death was notably cursory. The sheriff's report, less than 2 pages in length, focused almost exclusively on evidence found in and around Margaret's quarters, with no mention of examining Edward's study or personal effects. No one questioned why a woman, supposedly planning murder, would hide incriminating evidence in her own room, rather than disposing of it on the vast plantation grounds. These investigative oversights, glaring by modern standards, went unremarked upon by contemporaries. A diary belonging to Caroline Pemberton, discovered during an estate sale in 1923, but subsequently lost during a house fire in 1927, reportedly contained an entry from December 1837 that read, "Father seems determined that I should marry Edward Calhoun should he become available. When I reminded him that Edward is already married, Father merely smiled in that way that has always chilled me and said, 'Circumstances change, my dear. The wise prepare for tomorrow's opportunities today.'" The diary's authenticity was never officially verified before its destruction. The final known reference to the case came in 1958, when an elderly man named Robert Miller, claiming to be the grandson of gardener Thomas Miller, approached the Georgia Historical Society with what he described as his grandfather's true statement. According to society records, before Miller could present his evidence, he suffered a stroke and died 3 days later without regaining consciousness. No documents were found among his possessions relating to the Calhoun case, and so the story of Willow Creek Plantation remains incomplete, a puzzle with crucial pieces missing, some lost to time, others perhaps deliberately removed. What remains points to a disturbing conclusion that Margaret Calhoun may have been the victim of one of the most calculated miscarriages of justice in Georgia's antebellum history, orchestrated by the man who had vowed to cherish and protect her. Today, the land where Willow Creek once stood has been partially reclaimed by forest, partially developed into an anonymous suburban housing development. Most residents are unaware of the land's history, of the lives and deaths that unfolded there nearly 2 centuries ago. But in county archives, in fragmentary journals, in fading letters and forgotten testimonies, pieces of the truth remain, waiting for someone to finally assemble them into the full picture of what happened during that cold January in 1838, when a husband's ambition proved deadlier than any weapon, and a wife's voice was silenced before she could speak the truth that might have saved her. As historical research methods advance, perhaps someday Margaret's full story will emerge from the shadows of the past. Until then, she remains one of countless women whose lives and deaths were controlled by systems that refused to hear them, their truths buried, but not entirely lost to those willing to listen to the whispers that still echo through the pages of history. The creek still winds through the property, its waters reflecting sunlight and shadow in equal measure, revealing nothing of what it has witnessed, keeping its secrets as it has for almost 200 years. In 1962, an archaeological survey conducted by Emory University uncovered the remnants of a small structure approximately half a mile from the main Willow Creek House foundation. According to plantation maps from 1830, this building was not documented on any official records. The excavation yielded several artifacts of interest: a woman's silver hairbrush with the initials SC engraved on its handle, fragments of a porcelain doll, and most notably a sealed glass bottle containing a folded document. The paper inside had deteriorated to near illegibility, but infrared photography revealed fragments of what appeared to be a letter addressed to "My dearest sister." The handwriting, when compared to known samples, bore striking similarities to Edward Calhoun's. Dr. Eleanor Simmons, who led the excavation, noted in her report that the structure's location and the nature of the artifacts suggested it may have been a private residence rather than a typical slave quarter. Her preliminary conclusion, published in the Journal of Southern Historical Studies in 1963, suggested that the building may represent a more complex social arrangement than typical plantation hierarchies would indicate. Before she could conduct further research, however, funding for the project was unexpectedly withdrawn after a prominent Savannah family, descendants of the Pembertons, expressed concerns about historical sensationalism and threatened legal action. A ledger discovered in 1948 in the archives of a Charleston bank revealed that Edward Calhoun had withdrawn a substantial sum, equivalent to approximately $30,000 in modern currency, 2 weeks before Sarah's murder. No record exists of how this money was spent or invested. The same ledger shows a similar amount being deposited into his account 3 days after Margaret's death in prison. The bank clerk who made this discovery, preparing materials for a routine historical exhibition, reported that the ledger disappeared from the archive room overnight before it could be properly documented. In 1870, Joseph, the former slave who had witnessed Edward's movements on the night of the murder, was interviewed a final time by a northern journalist documenting Reconstruction in Georgia. By then, an elderly man, Joseph added a detail he had previously omitted. The bundle master carried that night. It moved, like something inside was struggling. I told myself it was just my eyes playing tricks in the darkness. I've carried that lie in my heart all these years. Tax records from 1837 show that Willow Creek Plantation was deeply in debt, with Edward Calhoun having borrowed against future crops that failed to yield as expected due to unusual weather patterns that year. A notation in the county clerk's records indicates that a foreclosure notice was prepared but never served. The date of preparation was January 15, 1838, 2 days before Sarah's murder. The foreclosure was officially cancelled on February 1, the same day the courts processed Margaret's inheritance transfer to Edward. A curious architectural feature of the Calhoun mansion, noted in a survey conducted before its collapse, was a series of hidden passages within its walls, not unusual in homes of that era, typically used by servants to move throughout the house unobtrusively. However, the survey noted that one such passage connected Edward's study directly to the servants' staircase, bypassing the main corridors entirely. This would have allowed him to move between his quarters and the servants' area without being observed by anyone in the main part of the house. In 1841, 3 years after Margaret's death, a Savannah physician named Dr. James Thornhill recorded in his private casebook treating Caroline Calhoun for acute nervous exhaustion and persistent nightmares. He noted that Mrs. Calhoun repeatedly mentioned the sound of scratching within the walls and believed she was being watched by someone who is no longer living. The doctor prescribed laudanum and recommended a lengthy stay with relatives in Charleston. Caroline remained away from Willow Creek for nearly 6 months. The county sheriff, who investigated Sarah's murder, Robert Calhoun Davis, resigned his position unexpectedly in 1842, selling his property and relocating to Texas. In a letter to his successor, he wrote cryptically, "There are burdens of office beyond those visible to the public eye. May you find the wisdom to distinguish between justice and expedience more successfully than I." No further correspondence from Davis exists in Georgia records, though Texas land grants show he established a modest ranch near Austin, far removed from his previous connections. In 1932, during the Great Depression, a descendant of the Pemberton family facing financial ruin attempted to sell a collection of family heirlooms, including items that had belonged to Caroline. Among these was a small diary, its leather cover weather-worn and pages yellowed. The potential buyer, an antique dealer from New York, later reported that upon examining the diary, he discovered several pages had been carefully cut out. When he questioned the seller about this, the man allegedly became agitated and withdrew the item from sale. The diary's current whereabouts remain unknown. In 1869, a former slave from Willow Creek named Abigail, who had served as Margaret's personal maid, gave testimony to a Freedmen's Bureau agent that contradicted key aspects of the prosecution's case against her mistress. According to Abigail, Margaret had been confined to her bed with a high fever on the night of Sarah's murder, so weakened that she could barely lift a glass of water to her lips, much less wield a knife with deadly force. Abigail stated that she had remained with Margaret until past midnight, only leaving when Edward himself arrived to sit with his wife. This testimony, if presented at trial, would have provided Margaret with a strong alibi. However, as a slave, Abigail would not have been permitted to testify against a white man in court in 1838. The murder weapon, a kitchen knife with a distinctive bone handle, was found in 1857 during renovations to the main house, hidden in a cavity behind the mantel in Edward's private study. The discovery, made by a carpenter, was reported to the new owners, who simply disposed of the knife without recognizing its significance. The carpenter later described the knife to his son, who recorded the description in his journal, stained dark along the blade, though whether by blood or merely time, father could not say. What struck him most was that it had been carefully wrapped in silk and placed in the wall with deliberate care, not simply lost or forgotten. Edward Calhoun's correspondence with Caroline Pemberton's father, dated November 1837, included a passage that takes on sinister significance in retrospect. The legal entanglements surrounding my wife's inheritance have proven more resistant to resolution than anticipated. However, I have consulted with attorneys who suggest an alternative approach might be possible under certain circumstances. I shall elaborate when next we meet in person, as some matters are best not committed to paper. Court transcripts reveal that during Margaret's trial, 3 potential witnesses who had been present at Willow Creek on the night of the murder were never called to testify. All 3 were slaves belonging to neighboring plantations who had been visiting relatives at Willow Creek. The prosecution claimed they had been removed to distant properties for seasonal labor and were unavailable. Records show, however, that all 3 had been hastily sold to a trader bound for Mississippi just days after Margaret's arrest, effectively removing them beyond the court's reach. The judge who presided over Margaret's trial, William Hargrove, had significant financial ties to the Pemberton family. County records show that he had borrowed heavily from Caroline's father to cover gambling debts in the years before the trial. This conflict of interest was never disclosed during court proceedings. In 1853, long after both Edward and Margaret were dead, Judge Hargrove suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. During his remaining years, according to his caretaker's journal, he was plagued by hallucinations in which he believed himself to be on trial, repeatedly murmuring, "Not guilty. She was not guilty." In 1915, renovation work on the old Savannah courthouse uncovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of what had once been the judge's chambers. Inside was a sealed letter addressed to "Whoever may find this in service of truth long delayed." The letter, written in Judge Hargrove's unmistakable hand but never sent, contained a confession. He had been approached by Edward Calhoun and Jeremiah Pemberton before Margaret's trial and offered financial considerations in exchange for ensuring a particular outcome. The judge wrote that he had initially refused, but ultimately yielded to pressure when reminded of his debts and the potential damage to his reputation should certain gambling indiscretions become public knowledge. The letter continued, "I have carried this shame through the years, watching as Edward Calhoun prospered from his cruel deception, knowing that I had failed in my sacred duty to uphold justice without fear or favor. The law provides no remedy now for Margaret, but perhaps in finding this you may at least restore to her name the dignity that was stolen along with her life." The courthouse clerk who discovered the letter brought it to his superior, who, after consultation with prominent citizens concerned with the county's historical reputation, decided to reseal the document and return it to its hiding place. It was rediscovered and finally made public in 1952, long after anyone directly involved in the case remained alive. Sarah's full identity remains one of the most elusive aspects of this historical mystery. Plantation records list her simply as Sarah Houseservant, with no surname or age recorded. However, a church baptismal record from 1825 mentions a Sarah Catherine, daughter of Willow Creek cook Mary, being christened at the insistence of the first Mrs. Calhoun, Edward's mother. If this was the same Sarah, she would have been approximately 18 years old at the time of her death. The absence of a surname in official records was typical of the time, but serves as a stark reminder of how the system of slavery sought to erase individual identities. In 1840, 2 years after Margaret's death, a traveller passing through Savannah noted in his journal a conversation overheard in a local tavern. A man, described as prosperous in appearance, though somewhat dissipated in countenance, was overheard boasting that certain problems resolve themselves when approached with sufficient determination. When his companion remarked that some obstacles seemed insurmountable, the man replied, "Nothing is permanent, my friend. Neither marriages, nor debts, nor inconvenient witnesses." The traveller noted that the conversation ceased abruptly when the men noticed his attention, and that other patrons seemed uncomfortable, as though this was a subject known to many, but spoken of by none. A physician's report, filed with the county but not presented at trial, noted that the pattern of wounds on Sarah's body suggested a frenzied attack, lacking the precision one might expect from a premeditated act. The same report observed that the killer had likely faced Sarah directly during the attack, evidenced by defensive wounds on her hands and forearms. This detail contradicted Edward's testimony that Margaret had stolen upon the sleeping girl and struck without warning. In 1850, a visitor to the Willow Creek Cemetery recorded an unsettling experience in his travel journal. Having heard rumors about the Calhoun case, he sought out Margaret's unmarked grave beyond the cemetery walls. As dusk approached, he observed a figure he initially mistook for another visitor, a well-dressed man who knelt briefly at the spot believed to be Margaret's resting place. The stranger placed what appeared to be a small posy of flowers on the ground before departing hurriedly when he noticed the journal writer. The visitor later inquired at his boarding house about the man's identity and was told, based on his description, that it could only have been Judge Hargrove, who made this pilgrimage every year on the anniversary of the hanging that never came. Among Edward Calhoun's personal effects, auctioned after his second wife, Caroline, fled north during the Civil War, was a small leather-bound book containing only blank pages, except for a single quotation inscribed on the first leaf. "What is done in darkness will be brought to light." No record exists of who purchased this curious item, nor whether Edward himself had written the quotation or received it as a message from another. In 1964, a history professor researching antebellum legal cases involving women defendants made a startling discovery in the attic archives of the old Georgia State Bank. Among uncatalogued papers was a draft will prepared for Edward Calhoun in December 1837, just weeks before Sarah's murder. The will, never formally executed, contained an unusual clause. In the event of Edward's death, his estate would pass not to Margaret, but to his cousin Robert Calhoun Davis, the same man who, as county sheriff, led the investigation that implicated Margaret in Sarah's murder. This draft will was dated December 21st, the same day that Margaret's journal, according to Whitmore's notes, recorded finding Edward's hidden ledger and confronting him about his financial dealings. The final piece of this historical puzzle emerged in 1968, when an elderly woman named Elizabeth Miller contacted the Georgia Historical Society claiming to be the granddaughter of Thomas Miller, the Willow Creek gardener who had observed Edward burning papers on the morning after the murder. According to Elizabeth, her grandfather had shared the full truth with his family shortly before his death in 1881. What he had actually seen Edward burning were blood-stained clothes, his own. Thomas had kept silent out of fear, having witnessed Edward returning to the main house from the direction of Sarah's quarters in the early hours of the murder, carrying what appeared to be a knife wrapped in cloth. When Edward noticed Thomas watching from the gardener's cottage window, he had approached and said simply, "A man protects what is his, Thomas. Remember that your family's well-being depends on your discretion." Elizabeth Miller provided the Historical Society with a sworn affidavit recounting her grandfather's deathbed confession, along with a small item Thomas had kept hidden for decades, a cufflink bearing Edward Calhoun's initials, which Thomas claimed to have found near Sarah's door on the morning after the murder. The Historical Society accepted these items into their collection, though they noted in their acquisition record that after the passage of so much time, and with all principal witnesses long deceased, the veracity of such claims must remain a matter of historical interpretation rather than established fact. And so the story of Willow Creek Plantation, of Edward and Margaret Calhoun, of Sarah, whose life was valued so little that even her full name went unrecorded, remains a complex tapestry of partial truths, deliberate obfuscation, and fragments of evidence preserved against considerable odds. What seems increasingly clear to modern researchers is that on a cold January night in 1838, a desperate man chose murder, not once but twice, to preserve his wealth and standing. First, he killed a young woman who perhaps knew too much about his financial dealings or his plans. Then, through careful manipulation of evidence and testimony, he effectively murdered his wife by the hands of a justice system, all too willing to accept the word of a respected plantation owner over that of a woman with no voice of her own. Visitors to the site today find little to mark the human drama that unfolded there. The land has been repurposed, the buildings gone, the creek continuing its eternal flow without regard for what transpired along its banks. Only in archives, in collected fragments of letters and diaries, in courthouse records and oral histories passed down through generations, does the story survive. A cautionary tale about justice denied, about voices silenced, about how wealth and power could once literally get away with murder. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph for this tragic chapter of Georgia's history comes from Margaret's own journal, in one of the few complete sentences Whitmore managed to transcribe before the document vanished. "Truth may be buried for a season, like seeds beneath winter soil, but given time and the light of careful attention, it will find its way to the surface." For Margaret Calhoun, that justice came too late. But in remembering her story, in piecing together the fragments of truth that survived Edward's careful efforts to bury them, perhaps we offer her a measure of the vindication she was denied in life. Her grave may be unmarked, her face forgotten, but her story, at last, is told. In 1969, the Georgia state legislature considered a symbolic posthumous pardon for Margaret Calhoun based on the accumulated historical evidence suggesting her innocence. The measure ultimately failed to pass, with opponents arguing that revisiting settled history serves no practical purpose. The debate, however, prompted renewed interest in the case among legal historians studying the evolution of evidence standards and gender bias in American jurisprudence. Today, the former Willow Creek Plantation is divided between suburban development and protected wetlands. A small historical marker, erected in 2001 by the Georgia Women's Historical Association, stands at the roadside. It reads simply, "Near this site stood Willow Creek Plantation, where in 1838 Margaret Calhoun was convicted of a murder that modern historical research suggests she did not commit. Her case remains a stark reminder of historical injustices faced by women in the antebellum legal system. Each January, on the anniversary of Sarah's death, fresh flowers sometimes appear at both the historical marker and in the now abandoned cemetery where Margaret's unmarked grave is thought to lie. No one has ever determined who leaves these memorials, a final mystery in a case where full truth may forever remain just beyond reach.